Okay, welcome everybody on site and online to this session, how the world will have to deal with the change in energy requirements and production in the coming years. That's a good question. That's a question for you tonight. And we are delighted to welcome Jean-Marc Jancovici here at INSEAD. You did a session online with us in the Conférence de l'INSEAD with Henri-Claude a couple years back in French, also for the local community, and everybody loves you so much, like everybody in France, that you are back thanks to the Industry Club who's organizing that meeting. Big kudos to you, Felix. I'm here. I don't know why I'm here, because you did all the work, basically, including for your club. So thanks for organizing the event. My name is Catel. I work with the Hoffman Institute here at INSEAD, and the Hoffman Institute is trying to push for sustainability to be integrated through everything that INSEAD does, its research, its teaching, all the way to its operations. And as you know, as you've seen on class, we still have a lot of work to do. This is why we are delighted to bring Jean-Marc Jancovici. He's an engineer by training. Do we have any engineer in the room? Okay, now we're talking. This is the Industry Club. You are, Jean-Marc, one of the leading voice in France on the energy transition and climate change. If you're not French, do you know, have you heard Jean-Marc before? Okay, so that's, okay, good for you. So that's the idea. So you've been working in that field for decades. You're the co-founder of the consulting firm Carbone 4, one of the first independent consultancy on low carbon strategy and adaptation to climate, creating in 2007. You're also the founding member of the think tank, the Shift Project, maybe why many of you know Jean-Marc more, creating in 2010. It's a think tank to inform and influence the policy debate in France and in Europe. You've been quite active over the past election in France. You've also asked all the new members of the government to go back to school and have an intensive course on climate change. We'd like to hear from you whether you've been successful in implementing that in the new government. I also wanted to mention that in March 2019, the Shift Project released the report Mobilizing Higher Education for Climate, which is directly focusing on our shop here. You looked at how energy climate topics were addressed in higher education. So it was in France. You looked at 32 establishments, and you find that only 11% of mandatory courses, core courses, were focusing on this topic. This morning I was at the HEC Climate Days, the first climate days in that business school. Tonight you're here. All this is great, but what we want, obviously, it's more core courses on the topic. Here at INSEAD, as you may know, we are in the middle of the curriculum review of the MBA. So that's a chance for everybody to go and do a little bit of advocacy on that project. Sorry, I'm using your event to make my push here. You're also a member of the High Council on Climate, an independent body tasked with providing advice and recommendation to the French government, as we just said. You've authored 7 books, including a recent comic book, Le Monde Sans Fin. Is it in English also? Or?
It's currently being translated.
So watch that space. You have controversial positions also in France, in particular when it comes to nuclear. We'll hear about this. Anyway, so we're very excited to have you. Thank you for joining us. So Jean-Marc will do his presentation. The idea is that, and I don't know if we can have the holding slide, that all questions are directed there with this QR code, okay? Then I think it will be you, Felix, asking the question. So please, during the talk, online and on-site, use the QR code, okay? And that's it, over to you. Thank you very much.
No, I'm sorry to start with a disappointment, but I'm not going to mention the word nuclear much during this talk, but you will survive. So I have slightly changed the title of this presentation. And for those of you who are in a hurry, the answer to this question is no. In fact, what I will try to explain is that if you sit in this room, if you have the opportunity to, I would say, follow the studies that you follow, and to consider working in an office, living in a city, eating plenty of food, moving around the world, getting clothes for nothing, etc. We all owe that to fossil fuels that are the 20th century. So they are not part of the 20th century, they are the 20th century. And so getting rid of fossil fuels without getting rid of the 20th century is going to be much, much, much faster said than done, in a nutshell. Now, this book was recently mentioned. For those of you who read French, what I will explain tonight or this evening is summarized or kind of described in this comic book, which is currently being translated in 10 languages, including English. But in English, it's only going to be a digital version to start with, because in this comic, we use a lot the feature of Iron Man. And in France, you can do that without getting sued, but you cannot do that in the US. So the paper version is not currently being printed in the US. It's only going to be available in digital format in English, but it's going to be available nonetheless. My talk can be summarized in this. This very simple identity explains that for the last 2 centuries, basically, if you look at the size of the economy, you look at the size of the energy consumption of the world, and if you look at the size of the energy consumption of the world, you look at the size of our CO2 emissions. Roughly, it's what has happened for the last 2 centuries. Going to focus on the last decades, for which I've got statistics before it's not as easy. But basically, the reason why it is so hard to get rid of CO2 emissions while keeping our economy, it's just because when you look at the physical flows that frame our productive system today, actually, we can measure it in kilowatt hours or in CO2 or in dollars. Actually, you look at the same thing. This plot, first one that goes with the identity I've just showed, is something that I've done for the first time 15 years ago, and I was very surprised by the results. Basically, I have plotted on this the GDP against the energy use in the world. It starts in 1965, and it follows time here until 2020, which is here. I do not have the statistics for 2021 right now. What you can see is that when you plot the world GDP against energy consumption, you roughly have a straight curve. Roughly, slightly bent, but roughly you have a straight curve. So the first part of my identity, which is that when you look at GDP, you look at energy and vice versa, is true. Second part of my identity. Here I have plotted, again, starting from 1965, CO2 emissions coming from energy use against energy use. And now you do not have something which is almost a straight curve, you have a straight curve, which means that for the 50 years that just elapsed, we have emitted exactly as much CO2 as we have used energy measured in joules or kilowatt hours, which means that the rise of renewable energies for the last years, actually, you cannot see it in this curve because fossil fuels have risen at the same pace or faster during the same period, okay? So for the last 50 years, we have emitted exactly as much CO2 as we have used energy. And so when you combine the two, you have here the predicament of the climate negotiators, which is that for the last 50 years, in rough figures, we have emitted as much CO2 as we have had GDP. So when you look worldwide, there is no such thing as decoupling. Okay, decoupling, which is the wish, the dream of economists, means that you have CO2 emissions decreasing while you have GDP increasing. What you can see on this curve, that when you look at the world, and actually you can look only at the world, because when you look at the country, at a given country, trade makes it so that energy is used, but added value happens somewhere else, okay? So the only way to have a comparable basis is to look for the world as a whole. And when you look at the world as a whole, you cannot say that we have had decoupling, okay? Not even a slight one. So this is a fact. Now, to understand why it is so, and is it a mere correlation, or is it a cause to effect relationship? Now we have to go back, sorry for those that are not engineers, back to physics. and understand what is energy. By the times that we currently live, a number of people, when you say energy, are probably going to say price and price, which is too high. Actually, a lot of debates that we used to have on energy and that we'll still have on energy goes with how much you have to pay for it. It happens that it is a possible answer, that energy is sometimes a bill, but actually it is not the first answer to have in mind. Otherwise, you miss the main point. I'm going to take the company that took me here, which is the SNCF, the National Railway Operator in France. The SNCF pulls trains, like the one you can see on that. When you look at the P&L of SNCF, they have people that they pay, and the people that they pay represents roughly half of the expenses. They also buy electricity and fossil fuels, because you have a number of trains in France that run on fossil fuels. Buying electricity and oil products, which is also something that SNCF does, represents 3% of their expenses. Now, let's suppose that the new Ministry of Transportation goes to the head of SNCF and says that your accounting is really too bad. I would like you to slash 3% of your expenses. Option A, the boss of SNCF fires 6% of the people. Okay, he's done the job, 3% of the, of course, you have a huge strike for a couple of weeks, you have no trains at all. Then for a number of following weeks, you have a couple of trains. Then after 3 or 4 months, the full traffic resumes, because obviously people have to eat, and so they have to get a paycheck. Maybe a couple % of the trains won't run, but will be it. Option B, the head of the SNCF stops to purchase electricity and fossil fuels. All the traffic stops for as long as these savings are done. What did I want to illustrate with this simple example? That the dependency of the modern economy on energy is not reflected by the share of buying energy into the full costs. Actually, if you look at energy as a bill, you miss the main point, which is that all activities are 100%, including yours, dependent on energy supply. Okay, so looking at energy as a bill is something that should never be done when you begin to investigate what we are dealing with the energy issue. Second possibility that you sometimes hear, energy is something that should be saved because, as you know, the best energy is the energy that we don't use. Well, we probably haven't listened much to that motto when you look at the energy used in the world for the last century and a half. So this graph shows you how much energy humanity has used for the last century and a half. What you can see on this graph is that all the energies that we have used have piled up one on top of the other. We used biomass, you see, we still use biomass, not much more, but we still use biomass. Then on top of biomass came coal, and we have never used as much coal as today. Then on top of coal came oil, then on top came gas, etc., etc. So far, no single energy has displaced a previously existing energy. Renewable energies that you can see in pink on top have not displaced fossil fuels. They came on top of fossil fuels, which is why you had the straight line that I showed you before when you look at the relationship between CO2 and energy. Renewable energies so far, worldwide, have not replaced fossil fuels. They came on top. If the name of the game is to replace fossil fuels, we failed so far. Actually, 80% of the energy used in the world today is fossil fuels. In 1974, it was 80% already. So the fraction of fossil fuels in the energy supply worldwide has remained at a steady 80% for the last 50 years. No change. It is going to change in the future, of course. So another thing that comes to the mind when we say the word energy is it's going to become renewable. Okay, so shouldn't bother about what I say because the problem is about to be solved. Well, it happens. I've got a very good news for you. 100% renewable world is possible. There is absolutely no issue with that. It is absolutely possible. Here is, for example, a world that was 100% renewable. Actually, 100% renewable world is so possible that it's the world in which we have lived for all the time that went from the apparition of humankind to 2 centuries ago. For all that time, the world was 100% renewable. So moving to a 100% renewable world, no big deal. The question is a 100% renewable world going to look like the world we have with INSEAD in Fontainebleau, people coming by car or by train and training to manage large multinationals? And the answer to that is not a single second. I'm going to explain afterwards. But it is perfectly possible to go back to a 100% renewable world. That is physically feasible. Okay, that is physically feasible. So, 3 answers that are not the proper ones, and actually the proper answer to energy, which is a way that I present energy in physical terms, is the last answer, that is the answer D. So let me introduce D. This is D. Actually, energy is the food of Iron Man. That's what energy really is. In physics, for those of you that have old reminds of that, energy is the unit which is used to quantify the change of the world. That's what energy is. It is a unit which is used in physics, and it is used to quantify, actually, how much a system is transformed. That's what energy is used for. So whenever you have a change of speed, heat, color, shape, chemical composition, nuclear composition, etc., you have energy which is involved. Anytime you have energy which is involved, it means that something has changed in the physical world. Okay, so energy is by definition in physics something that quantifies the change of the world. Using plenty of energy means that we have the ability to transform physically the world a lot. That's what it means. And actually, we do not transform it by ourselves with our small arms and legs. We use an exoskeleton, a huge exoskeleton, that of Iron Man, to do it for us. And oil, gas, and coal are obviously not things that you eat yourselves, but they are eaten by Iron Man, who is transforming the world for us. Actually, Iron Man has not the shape of Iron Man in the real world. It has this shape. But this is Iron Man. Iron Man is all the set of machines that have knitted your clothes, extracted oil from the ground that led to synthetic fibers that also led to your clothes, grown your food, transported your food, cooked your food, built your homes, transported you, etc. Iron Man is doing all this for us. And Iron Man has very, very, very big muscles. Let's take a couple of small muscles of Iron Man. I will explain it with a simple calculation in a couple minutes that if you look at the power of our own muscles, somebody who is physically fit and well-trained can produce, or actually can restitute, around 100 watts with his legs during a full day, and around 10 watts with his arms during a full day. 10 watts and 100 watts is not much, really not much. Because when you look at any machine that you have in our surrounding, you will see figures that are by far much, much higher. I'm going to take a first very simple device that I'm sure you have all used, which is a device that you use to mix your soup. I'm sure you have all done that at least once in your life. Yes? No? Who has never been in a kitchen in his life? Oh, okay. When you press on the button of that small device, which is ridiculously small, but that size, well, at the time you press on the button, you have the equivalent of 4 pairs of legs that begin cycling for you in order to move the axis of that device. Okay, so that device is as powerful has 4 pairs of legs that would begin cycling for you when you press on the button. And when you release the button, just like for Aladdin's lamp, the four people, hop, go back into the device and disappear. Suppose you use a vacuum cleaner because you have messed up all the kitchen. Using that vacuum cleaner, when you press on the start button, it's not 4, it's 10 bikers that appear by magic, start to cycle for you in order to move the vacuum cleaner, put it in motion. And then when you release the start button, hop, they vanish and go back into the machine. Take a lift, 50 people start cycling for you. Go into one of these nice little devices that shovel earth for you. And then it's by 10,000 that you multiply the power of your own arms, which is why it is now so cheap and so fast to build homes. When in ancient times, when you had to shovel and axe earth in order to remove it, what now takes a day took weeks or even months if there was a lot of stone. Now it's done just in one day with this kind of device. Go into the truck, or actually when the driver climbs into his truck, he's multiplying the power of his legs by 4,000. So actually it is not the driver who is driving the truck, it's the engine who is driving the truck. The driver is just there to give instructions to the engine. But the real power, you see, maybe the driver will be replaced by a software someday, but for sure, the engine will never be replaced by men. Okay, so the real power is in the engine. And take a steel mill. A steel mill is something that you are all dependent on because you all use steel. You have all been in some mean of transportation. They are all made of steel. This building is partially made of steel. The tractor who is going to grow your food is partially made of steel. So we are all dependent on steel. Today, we manufacture 2 billion tons of steel per year in the world. Take a steel mill. Well, the steel mill, a modern steel mill, we have 2 in France, has the same power as half of the active population that we have in the private sector in France. So in order to replace the 2 steel mills that we have in France with people with hammers, hammering steel all day, I would need to hire the full population, which is in the private sector in France, just to replace these 2 machines. Now I've showed you a little subset of our Iron Man costume. Actually, our Iron Man costume is composed of hundreds of billions of machines on Earth that are working for us all day round, all week round, all year round. We are fed, housed, moved around by machines, and all the objects that you can buy, all of them have been manufactured by machines. All of them. We are in a world of machines, and this world of machines is a world of fossil fuels. Okay? All of it. In order to understand how much energy is powerful compared to muscle power, let's suppose that you go and visit Paris. Paris doesn't look like this, but let's suppose that you go and visit Paris and you feel in good shape and you decide that you are going to climb on the top of the Eiffel Tower with your legs. You can try with your arms, but it's harder. With your legs. And as you feel in good shape, you're not going to do that once, you're going to do that 7 times in a row. With your legs, okay? No lift. By doing that, you will have climbed 2,000 meters up, and the energy that your legs will have provided is a mere ½ kilowatt-hour. For those of you who remember, it's just E equals mgh, very simple. So a mere ½ kilowatt-hour is all the energy that your legs will have provided through climbing 7 times on foot on top of the Eiffel Tower. If you do that 1 day out of 2, your legs will have provided roughly 100 kilowatt hours in a full year. If you shovel up earth, same thing, The example is 15 tons. That's what 6 cubic meters mean. 15 tons of earth lifted by 1 meter. At the end of the day, 0.05 kilowatt hour of energy provided by your arms. And at the end of the year, if you do this 1 day out of 2, apart from the blisters, you will have provided 10 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy at the end of the year. It happens that 10 kilowatt hours of thermal energy is what you have in burning a single liter of oil. A single liter of gasoline yields 10 kilowatt hours of thermal energy. If you put that into an engine, you're going to get 2 to 4 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy out of it. Which means that in a single liter of gasoline, which of course costs too much, everybody knows that, you have the same ability to transform the environment that in 10 to 100 days of hard labor of a man, which means that actually energy is not expensive. It costs nothing compared to the service that it provides once you put it into a machine. And if I look at this in economic terms, if I pay my kilowatt hour, or actually if I pay my worker at the minimum wage in France, called SMIC, my mechanical kilowatt hour will cost me a couple hundred euros to a couple thousand euros, when the machine is going to provide me the same service for a marginal cost of several 10 cents, which is roughly a couple hundred times to a couple thousand times cheaper. This is where our purchasing power lies. The fact that the products cost today nothing compared to what they cost 100 years ago is there. Productivity of work doesn't mean anything. We have not 50 pairs of arms today and 40 pairs of legs compared to what we were 2 centuries ago. We are not more productive ourselves. If you give a man a shovel, he's not going to shovel more earth today than he did 2 centuries ago. Work becoming more productive just means that we have machines working for us. So productivity of work is machines using energy added to workers. That's what it is. It's not coming from Mars, it's coming from oil. So when you look at economists saying, we don't know where productivity of work is coming from, of course we know. They don't know, but we know it's coming from machines. Less machines, less productivity of work. Meaning that in a world with less and less machines, the price of anything will increase in real terms. The price of anything will increase in real terms in a world with less and less machines. Just because the productivity of work in the past world, or in the past, is just due to the increase of the fleet of machines. This explains also why in Western countries, slavery disappeared. Assume you take a slave, which is not very moral, but was very convenient at times. In order to have a slave, you have to purchase the slave. You have to feed the slave, prevent the slave from slaughtering you, like in Django, and prevent the slaves from fleeing, okay? All this is going to cost you money. And if you compute the money that is going to cost you, I did it, you're going to end up with the result that even a slave is going to cost you 10 to 100 times more than the machine that doesn't go on strike, doesn't protest from its condition of machine, and is much more efficient. So the reason why we have transiently, unfortunately, wage slavery is just because it doesn't make any sense to bother with other human beings that are not very efficient when machines can perform the job much, much better for much, much less. So oil has set slaves free, which is not very good news because oil is loaded up with CO2. But it is oil that has set slaves free. If you look at the world fleet of machines, all the machines that work for us, always, everywhere, with their own food, which has the advantage of coming from below the ground, whereas renewable energies comes from above the ground. In past times, all renewable energies that we would use, starting with biomass, came from above the ground. So in a world that operates on renewable energies, you need the surface in order to get your energy. And particularly part of the surface is devoted to feeding animals that provide ground transportation and work also in the field. Shifting to fossil fuels has set all the surface free for feeding ourselves, building cities, roads, whatever. Going back to renewable energies is going to be something very difficult also for another aspect, which is that it's triggering use conflicts for the soil. Should we grow corn to feed cars, like in the US, or should we grow corn to feed human beings? 40% of the corn grown in the US goes into a car, which makes 14% at world level. Okay, so that conflict is going to increase with time. It's going to also push the price of grain up. So when you look at the fleet of machines in the world with its food, you can compute that it has multiplied the power of our own muscles, of the muscles of humanity, by a factor 200. Now I can put that in different ways. The first one is to say that on average, in a world without machines, a human being should have 200 slaves to live like today. On average. In Western countries, well, in Europe, sorry, it's close to 600. In the US, close to 1,000. And in this room, because you are paid much more than the average, close to 1,500 to 2,000. Okay. Next, another way to put it is that the world GDP in a world without machines would be divided by 200. Oh! What would INSEAD do in a world with the GDP divided by 200? Where would be the multinationals to manage? Where would be globalization, etc.? There wouldn't be. There wouldn't be. So you are the kids, as I am, of fossil fuels. All of you, all of us. Okay. Because your work, for most of you, or your job, or your future job, wouldn't exist in a world with the GDP divided by 200. Another way that I can put it is that in order to get the same GDP in a world without machines, we should multiply the human population by 200. So move from 8 billion people, which is already too much, because it's not going to be sustained for centuries, to 1,600 billion, which wouldn't last for even a decade. Okay. So that's what fossil fuels have done for us. And this is why you had this curve. So this curve is not a correlation. It's a cause-to-consequence relationship, because when you look at energy, you look at the active fleet of machines. Therefore, you look at the physical flows of transformation that you can calculate in dollars, or that you can restitute in dollars. Okay. So the size of the global economy is the size of the active fleet of machines. And today, the limiting factor of the economy is not the number of people able to work anymore. We have unemployment everywhere. It is the size of the active fleet of machines. For a while, France had a GDP that was higher than that of China. We never had a population higher than that of China, never. But for a while, we had an active fleet of machines bigger than that of China. So we had a bigger GDP, as simple as this. The rise of China today is the rise of its fleet of machines, fueled by coal, then oil and gas, and so the GDP rises. Very simple. So if you look at the energy consumption in a country, globally, you look at its GDP, globally. And because most energy is fossil fuels, this is also a cause-to-consequence relationship. It's not a correlation. And so you do not have, because the GDP increases coming from Mars, we don't know why, then energy consumption increases and CO2 emissions increase. No, it's because we have energy we can run machines, and then we have more GDP, but we also have more CO2. The two come along. The two come along. And so when Macron says that he's going to double the rate of decrease of CO2 emissions in France, he's not conscious of what he says. No, he's not conscious. Well, he's conscious of what he says. He's not serious. Because nobody has found any other way to decrease CO2 emissions at the proper rate that I'm going to explain later on without triggering a recession. It's just not possible physically today. The reason why you do not get that point when you look at economics is because of him and his colleagues. When classical economics were designed 2 centuries ago, they were designed considering that the only 2 limiting factors in our productive system came from humanity. So we would look at the number of people able to work, the amount of human capital, and with work and human capital, we could have a production. So basically, the economic system that we look at when we follow Jean-Baptiste Say and his colleagues, and which is the economic system that you learn here and from which you learn other things here. When you look at the balance sheet, for example, you look at prices. Prices come from this way of designing the economic system. We have 2 production factors, work and human capital. And if we have these 2 production factors, the supermarket is full. Isn't that the economy that you learn here? It is. When you look at physical flows, things are slightly different. In order to have the objects that you have on the right, these objects are constituted of atoms, okay, of matter. You cannot create atoms out of the vacuum, okay? The laws of physics strictly forbid that. So in order to have the atoms that you have in the products on the right, you have to get the atoms somewhere on the Earth. It's called resources. So the atoms that you have, for example, in your desk, made of wood, come from a tree that was harvested somewhere. That's a resource. The steel that you have for the legs of the desks comes from iron ore. We had iron on Earth. It was not created by man. Even Harry Potter doesn't know how to create iron ore. It happens that Earth had an endowment of iron ore that we are using presently, etc., etc. So in order to manufacture the products and to operate the services that derive from these products, because here you operate the service, teaching, but you need products to do so. You need desks, you need chairs, you need buildings, you need transportation means, you need mics, etc. So you need plenty of products, okay? It's not dematerialized. You need plenty of products. So in order to have anything produced by the economy, you need matter, that is resources, and you need the ability to transform that matter, which is work. And that work is performed for a slight part, very slight part, by us, and for the most part, by machines. Here you have a simplified diagram of what our economic system really looks like when you look at physical flows. We also have capital in that representation, which is an internal loop actually in the system. Capital, like for example, this building, is also obtained from natural resources and transformation. This building was obtained from natural resources and transformation, just as any other object that you have in this room. Only it's supposed not to be destroyed when you use it, which is good news because it's not going to collapse on us during this talk. In this representation of our productive system, you see that we can have other limiting factors. Suppose you have a limiting factor on the energy supply for whatever reason, because we want to mitigate climate change or because there is not enough oil below the ground. You will have a limiting factor on the active fleet of machines, and therefore you will have a limiting factor on production, therefore on GDP. So a decrease of the energy supply in volume is something that triggers a decrease of the GDP in volume. Even if you have plenty of people ready to work, even if you have plenty of people in the financial sector ready to invest. Okay, this is a limiting factor. And you have another limiting factor, which is natural resources. Suppose you have no fish to fish in the sea. You have less and less fish to fish in the sea. from 1995, fish catches have begun to decrease. So it's been now more than 25 years that catches in the ocean have begun to decrease. If you have no fish to fish, you can have plenty of people ready to invest in boats, in fishing companies, no production. And you have plenty of sailors ready to go and fish, no production. Okay. So you need natural resources. And if you have a shortage of natural resources, you will have a shortage of GDP. So when you look at physical flows, you realize that there are other limiting factors that can arise, especially coming from either environmental issues or the energy supply. If I summarize what happened during the last 2 centuries, I can summarize it this way. We have plenty of things on this planet, including fossil fuels. As all other natural resources, fossil fuels are free. They are free. No, gasoline is not free. Okay, gasoline is not a natural resource. Gasoline is something that has been transformed by our activity. The natural resource is oil, and nobody in this room paid a single cent for oil to exist. No one. Okay, so oil is as free as air that you breathe, as free as wind, as free as the sun, and as free as fish in the ocean. All this is free, as free as iron ore. Okay. The steel or the iron ore that BHP Billiton sells you is not free, because meanwhile you had people working and people in the finance industry investing, but that's only people. It's not, nature doesn't send you a bill. Okay, so oil is free. Fossil fuels burn, which means that they can put machines in motion, and these machines, in turn, will transform all the other natural resources that are also free in order to manufacture all that we have at hand. This process of putting machines to work instead of us has created plenty of things that have fully changed the shape of the world. First, we have more free time because machines are manufacturing our clothes, our food, our homes, etc. We do not need to work as much as before. In France, for example, the annual working time has been divided by 2 between the beginning and the end of the 20th century. And it's not only because we have communists and socialists in France that want people to work less. No, it's been the same everywhere. Everywhere, the working time has decreased. A little bit more, a little bit less. And because we work less, we can study for longer, we can retire. We didn't exist 1.5 centuries ago. We can go on holidays. We can rest for the full weekend, except you, maybe you study. And we can work only 35 hours a day in France and close to 40 hours a day in many other countries. All this we owe to machines. Because machines are working for us in the fields and in the mines and in the factories, we can all live in cities where all our work is to exchange the goods and services produced by machines. What is a city? It's a place where you exchange. All cities were built around the church, where you exchange moral rules, the marketplace, where you exchange goods, the school, where you exchange knowledge, and the representation of the central power, be it the king or the president, whatever. That's all cities, okay? And all people lived in a disk, which is the geometrical form, which is the most efficient to put the most people closer to the places where exchanges took place. Okay, so old cities, all of them, are disks with these places to exchange at the center. More and more people living in cities means that nobody is needed in the countryside anymore. And we can all live in a place where we exchange all the time. And what is the type of occupation which corresponds to exchange? Services. Services are exchanging goods, information, whatever. Goods and information, basically. Okay. What is a bank? A place where you exchange information. What is an insurance company? A place where you exchange information. Basically, no goods. What is a stock market? A place where you exchange information. what is, I don't know, a mall, a place where you exchange goods. All these places we exchange. The more energy you have in a country, or the more energy per capita, the higher the urban population is, expressed at the fraction of the global population. The lower the agricultural population is, expressed as a fraction of the working force. We have globalized the world. Globalizing is oil. Remove ships, no globalization anymore. Ships are oil. Remove planes, a little bit less globalization. Remove trucks, trucks are oil. Okay, so remove trucks, ships and planes, and with globalization, etc., etc. So the modern world, again, fossil fuels are not part of the modern world. They are the modern world. They are the modern world. This fairy tale is going to experience two limits in the coming decades. Some of them have already been experienced, we have already begun to experience them in some places. The first one is an upstream bottleneck. It takes 4 million to 400 million years to form oil, gas, and coal from living organisms, let's say. So at time scales that we are interested in, which is a couple of centuries, or when you work in a listed company, 6 months, they are not renewable. They are not renewable, okay? So we have an endowment, an initial endowment, which is given once and for all. And I will explain what mathematical conclusion you can derive from that. But the certainty is that after having more, we'll have less. A second bottleneck, because we have many others on biodiversity, etc., that I'm not going to mention tonight, is climate change. It happens that this industrial civilization has led to putting more and more CO2 into the atmosphere, and CO2 doesn't want to get rid easily from the atmosphere once it's there. And this is triggering a massive change of the climate system that for which we are only seeing the first consequences. Much more is to come. And in between, we have our holy GDP, which is blind to this, and blind to many other things. These are the greenhouse gases emissions arising from human activity for the last century and a half. You can see that for that period, it has endlessly grown, increased. And actually, when you look at any technical innovation that has happened during that period, none of them has self-standing stopped or triggered a decrease of CO2 emissions, okay? We have invented plenty of things, okay? We have invented electricity, didn't decrease emissions. Trains didn't decrease emissions. Computers didn't decrease emissions. Office work, cities didn't decrease. The digital, nothing decreased global emissions. One of the things that you should keep in mind is that it's going to be the same in the future. No technical innovation by itself triggers a decrease of CO2 emissions. No single one. No single one. So engineers are useful, of course, but trusting engineers, believing that technical fixes will do the job in an otherwise unchanged world is an illusion. It will not happen. It didn't happen in the past. It will not happen. Climate change has been known for 2 centuries, okay? The first scientific paper that was published on climate change was published by Joseph Fourier, Cocorico, almost 2 centuries ago, 1824. And in 1824, Joseph Fourier stated that there was something in the atmosphere that he called greenhouse effect that was trapping heat close to the ground. The gases that were at the origin of that trapping heat effect were identified in the first part of the 19th century. In 1912, in the country of Hobbit, that is New Zealand, an article was published in a paper explaining that because of the amount of coal that was burned on Earth, the amount of CO2 was increasing into the atmosphere, and that it would have considerable effects, I quote, considerable effects in a couple centuries, 1912, in New Zealand. Sorry if there are anybody coming from this country in this room, but not precisely the center of the scientific world in 1912, okay? So if it was known in New Zealand in 1912, it's that it was already broadly known for a number of people. So we know that climate change exists. We have known for decades now that it's going to lead to something very dangerous. We have done plenty of technical innovations. Didn't change the fate of the world. So most probably the solution lies elsewhere. Most probably. Carbon dioxide is an oxide. Dictionaries were made. It happens that oxides on Earth are extremely stable molecules. When a compound is in the form of an oxide, basically nothing happens to it. There is an oxide that you use every day, or should use every day, otherwise your mate is going to complain, which is oxide, the oxide of dihydrogen, water, that is. Water is an oxide of hydrogen, and you use water every day. It happens that on Earth, water has remained under the form of water for 4 billion years. I think you can call that stable. Okay. Since the apparition of oxygen in the atmosphere a couple 100 million years ago, all iron that you can find on Earth has oxidized and has remained under the stable form of iron oxide, this is iron ore, for hundreds of million years. So oxides are extremely stable molecules. Well, CO2 is not an exception. Once CO2 is in the atmosphere, there is no process to remove that CO2 from the atmosphere. In order for CO2 to get out of the atmosphere, it has to go back in contact with the soil, where it can be either eaten in a way by plants through photosynthesis, or dissolved into the ocean, which is a simple physical process of two fluid compartments communicating one with the other. Those are the only two processes that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which explains why you have here on this graph something which is absolutely crucial to understand the issue that we face. The day we stop emissions, we have now created a surplus of CO2 into the atmosphere, okay? The day we stop emissions, that surplus is going to slowly decrease thanks to photosynthesis, if any remains, and thanks to part of the CO2 dissolving into the ocean until the ocean is full of CO2 and cannot take anymore. Well, those processes are slow, which means that 1 century after the day we stop emissions, 40% of the surplus of CO2 that we have created will still be in the atmosphere. 1,000 years after we stop emissions, 20% of the surplus will still be in the atmosphere. 10,000 years after we stop emissions, 10 to 15% of the surplus will still be in the atmosphere. This means that the state of the atmosphere for the historical times to remain will never go back to what it was in pre-industrial times. And because of the lag that we have between the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and a number of consequences of the climate system, the climate system that we had in 2000 will never go back. And even the climate system that we have in 2022 is going to disappear forever in the future. Forever. Okay. From now on, you and me are going to live in a drifting system, and a normal state of the system doesn't exist anymore. You see, a normal state is normally a stable state, and you go back to normal after a transient crisis. This is not going to exist anymore for the climate system, anymore, ever. It's sad news, but it's a physical reality. Of course, this issue is going to elapse over time frames which are way over what we are used to manage. It's way over a lifetime, way over several lifetimes, and of course, way over any mandate of any elected government and any long-term strategy of any listed company and even non-listed companies. We are today accustomed to managing the systems that surround us on timeframes that are 2 to 3 orders of magnitude under what we should have in mind if we want to address this issue correctly. Addressing this issue correctly requires that we act with a time horizon of 100 to 200 centuries. Who does that? What company does that? What government does that? No one. So they are all going to fail. Until something happens and the system is not going to be as liberal as today, which will happen for sure in the future. It's just a matter of time. I can't say how, can't say when, can't say where, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen because, of course, because of the consequences. But so you can see on this graph, again, something which is absolutely crucial, which is that we have triggered a climate drift, which now cannot be stopped. I insist, cannot be stopped. For example, the embedded ocean rise into the already existing temperature increase is something, if my memory is correct, which is 10 to 15 meters. And it's going to happen for millennia starting from now, even if we stop emissions. So the climate system, I insist, is going to drift whatever we do. Whatever we do. What is still in our power is to limit the drift, but we cannot stop it anymore. Because of the very, very great stability of CO2 into the atmosphere, the CO2 concentration is steadily increasing following our emissions. What you can see on this graph is that the COPs, you know, the time in the year where all the countries gather in one place and discuss climate issues, you could stop them, wouldn't change anything. Here is COP1 that happened in Germany, Angela Merkel being Ministry of the Environment. It was a great success because it was the first time that all the countries that ratified the Climate Change Convention gathered together. Big success, okay? So you see what happened before the big success and what happened after the big success. This is Kyoto, also a big success. Western countries committed to decrease their emissions. You can see the result. This is a big failure, Copenhagen, because countries couldn't get to an agreement. This is a big success, Paris, this is a big, okay. The fact that the COP is a big success or a big failure is only the idea that the press has when the press writes articles about the COP. Okay, it is not worth anything more. Actually, the COPs are useless. If they were of some use, you would see something happening on this curve. Did you see something happening on this curve? No. You know, in physics, where you perform an experiment, and one of the result is always the same, independently from the value of a given parameter, what you conclude is that the parameter has no effect on the experience. That's what you do in physics. So what you can conclude here is that the COPs have no effect on the trajectory of the world, which is true, which is true. Now, the drift will go on, just like in good songs. Here you see a graph, with the vertical scale where in degrees Celsius, and the 0 on that curve corresponds to the average temperature of the planet Earth for the last half of the 19th century. So you compute the average temperature for all the surface and all the time between 1850 and 1900. And that is your 0 for the graph that you have here, the curve that you have here. What you can see is during the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, the average temperature already took 1 point something degree, 1.1 say. At 1.1 degree, we have already killed 15% of the corals, more than 50% of the Great Reef Barrier of Australia. We have triggered massive fires in Siberia, massive fires in Australia, massive fires in Canada. We have triggered droughts, unprecedented. We have triggered floods, unprecedented, etc. We have triggered hurricanes, unprecedented. And this is only, and 10% of the French forest is going to die anyway. Okay, that's 1.1 degree. in the future, if we meet the Paris Agreement, we will remain below 2 degrees. Actually, you must know that in order to follow these curves, it means that from that not only in 2050 we fully stop emitting CO2, so we do not use a single gram of oil, a single gram of coal, a single cubic meter of gas, but on top of that, we pump CO2 from the atmosphere. That's among the hypotheses, if you go and look, of these scenarios. Who in the room is ready to bet all his or her savings on that option? No? You are? You won't be dead in 2050. You won't be dead. You have debt. No, I'm talking only of the assets, not the debts. This is a scenario in which basically we use all the coal that we can find, and of course, all the oil and all the gas. So you see that at the end of the century, there is a huge difference depending on what is going to happen with CO2 emissions in the coming decades. But you can also see that in the 20 years to come, these scenarios show very little difference in the temperature rise, which reflects the great inertia of the system facing the great inertia of our social and economic system, because emissions are not going to stop overnight. If emissions stopped overnight, the temperature will stop to increase overnight. But the emissions are not going to stop overnight. And in the 20 years to come, actually, the Paris Agreement doesn't make a big difference with a very intensive scenario. Another way to put it is that the day we decide to pull on the brake heavily, the car is going to accelerate more and more for the 20 years to come, whatever we do. Basically, that's the way you can put it. So if we decide to brake the day we see the wall, all we are certain is that we will hit the wall. That's because of the inertia of the system. I can put it another way. The day we begin to act because the consequences are unbearable, the only guarantee that we have then is that later on it will be worse. All this has been known for decades. If it has not been taught here, it's not my fault. It has been known for decades. Okay? All this was in the first IPCC report issued in 1990. It was. One day, the future becomes the present. That's how it is. Heat waves are going to increase much faster than the average temperature. On this graph, I'm just going to elaborate on the right part. You have the increase in frequency of heat waves that in the past used to happen twice per century. You see that these heat waves that used to happen twice per century in the climate of the late 19th century, in a world warming by 4 degrees, would happen almost every year, 40 years out of 50. With an average temperature reached, which is roughly 4 to 5 degrees over the maximum temperature that was attained in the heat waves of the past. This literally means that we roast, literally. I will show you another pleasant thing later on. In order to understand what really means a couple degrees of the global in the global temperature, I'm going to show you two maps. This is the map of the pre-industrial Europe. So Europe before using fossil fuels, let's say Europe of the 19th century. If we don't chop down trees in order to make room for something else, fields, cities, whatever, the plants that can be found in Europe are mostly trees, meaning that the climate is mild enough, not too hot, not too cold, and humid enough, rains enough, so that we have big plants that are trees. This is Europe 20,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, we were in the, well, not we, but our remote ancestors were in the middle of an ice age. Okay, actually they were at the ice age maximum, the last glacial maximum. And Europe was much colder than today. I don't know whether there are students here coming from Sweden, but at the time, this wouldn't have happened because Sweden was under ice, as was Norway, as was Finland, as was the northern part of Germany. No Canadians here either. All Canada was buried under ice, and no Northern Siberians, but I don't think there are many, because also Northern Siberia was buried under ice. In order to, and good news for those that like rugby and are French, the Irish and the Scots are also under ice, which is the main information that I was about to forget. Because of all these huge glaciers that took place on northern parts of the Northern Hemisphere, plenty of water was removed from the ocean. Okay, nature transferred a huge amount of water from the oceans to glaciers on the ground. The level of oceans decreased in consequence by 120 meters. So there was no sailing in the British Channel because there was no channel, no tax haven in the Channel Islands because no Channel Islands, obviously. And you can see that the coastline was very, very different from what it is today. As it was much colder, it was much drier, and the ecosystems that took place at the time in Europe looked like what you have now in the northern part of Siberia. Steppe, okay, little shrubland, not much. And in France, the overall population was close to, was the order of magnitude of the population of Fontainebleau today. Okay, same order of magnitude for the full country. Okay. This is France during the last glacial maximum. When Europe went from the state on the left to the state on the right, it obviously took place in the course of a global warming. That global warming for Earth as a whole was only of 4 to 5 degrees in 10,000 years. So here you can see the result of a full-scale experiment that Mother Nature performed for us, which is warming the world by 4 to 5 degrees in a couple thousand years. And you can see the result. Now, before detailing just a little the consequences of what we have triggered, what I can tell you is that warming the world by 4 degrees in a century is basically going to be war and turmoil everywhere. Forget democracies, forget globalization, forget traveling, forget living in good health, forget not living in a state of fear. All this is going to vanish. All this, okay? That's what is at stake with 4 degrees. Question, is it more or less important than the net profits of the next quarter? So far, the answer is it is less important, much less important, okay? Much, much less important. Is it a good way to prioritize our issues? Not sure. What happens the day we realize it was not the good way, as I've just explained before, later on, it gets worse. This is a tremendous issue because we have to represent ourselves something that never happened and do all we can in order that it never happens, which is something that we are not designed to address easily because we're animals and we just trust our senses. If we look at the same thing that I just explained with a curve, this is a curve that represents the average temperature on Earth for the last 10,000 years, except for the last century. So you see, for all the time that elapsed between 8,000 years before the birth of Mr. Jesus Christ to 2,000 years after, the average temperature on Earth was remarkably stable because here you have the same scale that I've used before. It varied by only a fraction of a degree. And if you are here in this room today, and I am here in this room today, we also owe it to this great stability that enabled our ancestors to settle and develop agriculture. Because you cannot develop agriculture in a world where the climate system is changing all the time. Because you are not resilient enough to start some kind of crop somewhere and have to change it 10 or 20 years after. Can do that, or even 100 years after. So this great stability has also been a determinant factor of what we are today. This is moving out of the last ice age. You can see the speed at which it happens on this curve. This is what we have done during the course of the 20th century. What you can instantly visualize on this graph is that we have not witnessed already all the consequences of the temperature rise that already happened. We have not witnessed all the consequences. They are not instant. Okay. And this is what would happen with a so-called business as usual scenario that is 3 degrees extra by 2100. At the current pace, we will cross the threshold of 1.5 degrees in 20 years, 15 years. There is no way back. Contrary to the scenarios, to the fairy tale scenarios that say that we could overshoot and then go back to below 1.5, that doesn't exist. Once we're over 1.5, we will remain over 1.5. Okay. 1.5 in 15 years, we're there. Okay, at the current pace. Except there is a plague, COVID, whatever, which might happen. These maps show you, I'm sorry, this is 2 degrees, and this is 4.5 degrees in 2100. These maps show you the places on Earth in 2050 and 2100, where you have a number of days in the year with this color scale, where outside conditions do not allow someone to stay alive for over a couple hours. Why is that? It's because in these places that are hot because you're close to the equator and humid because you're close to the equator, in the external conditions, I would say associate a temperature over the temperature of your skin, that is 35 degrees Celsius. With 100% humidity, you cannot cool down your body through communicating heat to the air because the temperature of the air is over the temperature of your body. And you cannot sweat, which is the other way that you cool down because the air is already saturated with humidity. And so sweat cannot evaporate from your body. And within a couple hours, you can die of hypothermia. You can see that with a 2 degree scenario, a number of places on Earth, particularly Southeast Asia, part of India, part of China, all the Amazon basin, and part of Asia are unlivable in the true sense, 3/4 of the year or more. Where do these people go? Elsewhere. How many are there? A couple 100 million to a couple billion. Is it going to be nice and pleasant? Of course not. Of course not. And that's only with the 2 degree scenario, which we are not meeting right now. Precipitations are going to change. In a number of places, precipitations are going to increase, but tough luck for us, precipitations are going to increase a lot where we don't live, which is in the middle of the Pacific. They are going to increase close to the poles, but we don't live much there. They are going to increase in some continental places, but it's going to vary a lot, depending on the time in the year. So you will have flooding in winter and possibly droughts in summer. And they are going to decrease in a number of places, including all the surroundings of the Mediterranean basin and part of America, etc. Precipitations are going to change, but evaporation is going to increase everywhere because in a hotter climate, evaporation increases, which means that the humidity of soils is going to decrease in most places where humans have settled, which means that crops are going to decrease in most places where humans settled. Which means that what we are witnessing today, with the turmoil in Ukraine is only the beginning of what will happen more and more often in the decades to come. This graph coming from the IPCC with a color scale that says that at yellow, it's local and manageable, and in purple, it's global and hardly manageable, tells you that starting from 2.5 degrees of global warming, of course, it's not a strict prediction, you will have political instabilities, that's what it means, coming from food supply instabilities all over the world. This graph shows you for about 1/3 of emerged land that are considered biodiversity hotspots, how biodiversity is going to evolve in a 2-degree scenario. So when the temperature increase reaches 2 degrees, what has happened? Well, all the zones here that are in purple, that correspond to the zones here that are in purple, are places where most of the biodiversity will have disappeared. In red, a significant fraction, but you can see that at 2 degrees, about 80% of 1/3 of emergent land has biodiversity that has extremely strongly eroded. And of course, on top of that come other pressures, such as pollution, such as pesticides in agriculture, etc. This is only for global warming. Marine biodiversity is also going to decrease. And on top of that, you should add overfishing, pollution, etc. Photosynthesis that was stronger and stronger over years until 2000 because more CO2 in the atmosphere with a stable climate or with a climate that didn't drift too much means that plants strive more because the climate is always the same. You have more CO2, that is more food, so they strive more and more. From 2000 now, that's all the zones that are colored in red, photosynthesis has begun to decrease over years, meaning that ecosystems are more and more stressed. Extreme events are going to increase in intensity. This is something which is pretty simple to explain with the hands. As I've explained, the greenhouse effect traps heat close to the soil, so the temperature close to the soil increases, but conversely, the temperature of the stratosphere decreases, which means that the temperature difference between the soil and the stratosphere increases, which means that the strength of the convection increases, and increasing the strength of convection means that all the extreme events that derive from a strong convection will increase in intensity. Hurricanes or cyclones, same thing. And most probably, even if the models are not conclusive because it's phenomena that are too small for the resolution of models, and most probably also thunderstorms and tornadoes. Greenland has begun to melt. It will go on melting now for centuries, for the centuries to come, no matter what, because there are instabilities and positive feedbacks that will lead to increasing melting. The western part of Antarctica is at risk of collapsing. The western part of Antarctica, well, there is no western part because the southern pole is here, but this part of Antarctica, you have Chile here, is made of a huge house of cards of glaciers that each consolidate its neighbors, just like in a house of cards. If you begin to destabilize, well, if the glaciers that lead to the sea begin to destabilize because the sea level rises and the sea temperature increases, which means that the sea is eating, so to say, the ice shelf by the bottom, you begin to destabilize the ice sheets, then you destabilize the glaciers that flow to the sea, and you destabilize the rest, particularly if you know that all this house of cards is resting on the bedrock, which is mostly below sea level. If Western Antarctica collapses, it's a couple meters. It's not going to happen in a week, could happen in a century, or a couple centuries, but could happen in a century, it's a question mark. Then the sea level increases by a couple meters all over the world. If you pile up all the contributions to sea level increase to 2,300, that is thermal expansion of the water, continental glaciers, and ice caps, you cannot exclude, this was in the last IPCC report, that the sea level rises by 15 meters in a couple of centuries. 15 meters, you do not have a single harbor left. You do not have a single coastal city where the coast is flat, which is left. About 3/4 of Florida are below water, but I don't care because the US is emitting too much. No, I don't care. Alligators will survive. No, I'm kidding. So Bangkok is below water, Saigon is below water, Shanghai is below water, Le Havre is below water, Marseille is below water for part, etc. All the cities are below water. The ocean is going to become less and less alkaline, which is called more acid, which will bar or prevent the formation of lime for all the animals that need to form lime. All the microorganisms that you have in plankton, coral, part of corals, part of mollusks, etc. The global overturning of the Atlantic Ocean is at risk of slowing down or even collapsing. Of course, in a warming world, you will have more and more microorganisms that will thrive, and you will have more and more surprises regarding diseases for animals, plants, and human beings. Trying to figure out what I've explained can induce on human society is basically a full set of question marks. Okay, nobody is able to say July 2nd, 2037, this is going to happen if the global temperature has risen by 1.47 degrees in Bangkok. Okay, nobody can tell you that ever. So we'll have to address this issue with the uncertainty which is associated to it. And there is no other way to do so. There is no other way to do so. The only thing which is certain is that we'll have surprises. As time passes by, surprises will increase in magnitude, increase in adverse effects, and happen more and more often. That's all that can be said. So again, if we wait to experience the full magnitude of the issue, it's too late. Just like saying if you jump from the Eiffel Tower, on which you have climbed on foot, of course, you jump from the Eiffel Tower, and when you are 10 meters from the ground, you say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Fair enough. It's exactly the image that you should keep in mind regarding global warming. Same thing. Okay? The day we say we shouldn't have done that, too late. And you cannot see that in the prices because the Earth is free. Which is why when economists try to assess the damage of climate change, here is, for example, one bracket that they get. But actually, as natural assets are worth zero in our economic convention, how much is worth a damage to an asset which is worth zero? Well, zero. No? How much is a fraction of zero? Zero. So all the attempts that economists have made to figure out how much could climate change cost are just wild guesses, when you look at the models that they have used. Actually, it's tautological models that they use. They make an external hypothesis which embeds the value of the result. And Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize for that. It's a big joke. So this is one among many papers, and I've picked this one because I find it funny, because these economists have said every time we emit 1 ton of CO2, the value that we got, the apparent economic value that we got from emitting that ton of CO2 is actually 1/60th of the damage that we have caused through emitting that ton of CO2. If they are right, the only sound thing to do tomorrow is decrease the GDP to 0 as fast as we can. Do you agree? No? If you run a business where you lose 60 each time you invest 1, you stop investing. Do we agree? It's exactly what we are doing today, say these economists. So we should stop the business. You don't agree? That's exactly what we should do, stop the business. That's where maximizing the economic value is stopping GDP. No? I see you're a little puzzled, which means that what should really puzzle you is not necessarily stopping the business, because that will happen anyway, but it is trusting economic values when it comes to the damages of climate change. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because you cannot figure out. You see, for example, the damage of removing 20% of oxygen from the air is 100% of the GDP. And this oxygen in the air is free. So it doesn't make any sense to try to do this kind of calculation. Which means, by the way, that if we try to address climate change as an economic issue, we will go nowhere. It has to become an ethical issue or a moral issue. It has to go into what is good and what is bad, what is evil, basically. If we try to solve it as an economic issue, we will never solve it. Never, ever. Never. And I run a company, but still, we will never solve this issue addressing it as an economic issue. This graph tells you what should be done if we want to limit global warming to a given value. It's just explaining how much the temperature rises depending on the overall amount, the cumulated amount of emission of CO2 that we have put into the atmosphere. Because of the very long residence time of CO2 into the atmosphere, all that counts is the cumulative amount of our emissions, okay? Not the instant value. At the end of 2020, I should change that for 2021, it doesn't change much the conclusion. Humanity had emitted for the century and a half that had elapsed about 2,300 tons, a billion tons, sorry, of CO2, leading to a temperature increase of 1.1 degree, give or take 0.05. If we want to limitate global warming at 1.5, we should limitate overall emissions at 3,000 billion tons of CO2, of which 2,300 have already been emitted. So 700 remain, okay, for the rest of the century. If we take into account the fact that we would be 9 billion people, 10 billion people, sharing these 700 billion tons for 9 to 10 billion people for 80 years means that per individual and per year, we should decrease emissions by a factor 10 compared to what people that died today had during their lifetime. By 10. If we want to stick to the 2-degree scenario, then we can emit 3,500, and then a baby born today can emit a sixth of the emissions of his grandparents that died today. A sixth. Sticking to 2 degrees means that we should slash emissions as fast as we could, at least divide them by 3 in the 28 years to come, which means that we should decrease them by at least 5% per year on a world basis. A 5% decrease is what we had in 2020 because of the COVID. We should repeat that decrease, not just 5% and then we're done. No, we should have an extra COVID each year in order to meet the 2-degree objective. An extra COVID each year. The probability that we get there with just technical fixes is no. It's not slight, it is no. The only things that can get us there are either pandemics, okay? the size of the population decreases by 5% per year, fair enough, that can do the job, or a world recession of at least 4% per year, each year. Okay, forget working for Goldman Sachs. Forget working for BlackRock. Okay, so when BlackRock said, we are in favor of net zero, they were in favor of a contraction of the GDP by 4% per year. Then they realized what it meant, and they said, no, actually, we're in favor of long-term revenues, which is exactly what they said a week ago. Good news for them, they will have neither one or the other because of what I'm going to explain, that I will skip because it's too late, that I will skip also. I'm going to the second bottleneck, which is energy supply. As I've said, we have an endowment in fossil fuels, which has been given once and for all. When you pull from a stock, which has been given once and for all, it is mathematically possible to demonstrate that you cannot have an ever-growing supply coming from that stock, okay? You cannot indefinitely have each year more than the previous year coming from that stock. This is impossible, because if you had that, the stock would be infinite. You cannot even have a supply which is constant for an infinite amount of years. All you can have, this is a mathematical theorem that I can still demonstrate, is something that looks like this. When you have a stock which is given once and for all, the consumption coming from that stock, the annual consumption coming from that stock, you can demonstrate that if you go far enough in the past, it was nil. That is easy to demonstrate, actually. If you go far enough in the future, it will go back to nil. And in between, you will have an absolute maximum called the peak. This is true for oil, but it's true for gas. It's true for iron ore, for copper, for gold, for silver, for chromium, for rare earth, for anything that gets from the crust. There will be a peak to the annual production. The only questions are where, when, and is it a problem or is it not a problem? Okay, but you will have one. Regarding oil, the International Energy Agency issued in 2018 a document report saying that regarding conventional oil, which is all that is not tar sands in Canada and shale oil in the US, went through an absolute maximum in 2008 and has been decreasing since then. If you add on top shale oil, this is the perspective that we issued at the SHIP project 1 year ago. It's actually the supply of the world, excluding Brazil and Canada, because we were looking at the supplies of Europe. Okay, so it's the top 16 producers of the world, excluding Brazil and Canada. And what the people that performed this analysis said, and these people were two former top executives coming from Total, now Total Energy, plus the former oil analyst of the IEA. And what they said is that most probably the oil supply coming from the top 16 producers is going to be divided by 2, including shale oil, in 2050 compared to today. And as Europe is importing 94% of its oil, it means that for Europeans, the available oil is going to be divided by anything between 2 and 10. So, like it or not, fossil fuels are going to contract in Europe. The fleet of machines is going to contract in Europe and actually in the hinterland of Europe. And so GDP is going to contract in Europe, like it or not. And all the other countries are going to follow. It's just a matter of time. If you look at the OECD zone at large, this is the rate of change of the energy supply, that is the active fleet of machines in the OECD zone since 1965. And you can see that the energy supply was increasing by 4% per year, increasing by 2%, that's the oil shocks. You had a recovery after, increasing by 1, increasing by 0, and decreasing. And when you look at the GDP growth rate, this is what is happening. It's a little bit over because you have efficiency and because you have false GDP in the inflation of assets. And now you have inflation of assets everywhere, which is creating false GDP. But it's a little bit long to explain. But it's going to follow. So we will not reimburse the debt with future growth. We will reimburse the debt with default or inflation. We will not increase wages in real terms. wages will decrease, etc., etc. So the world in which you're about to live, and I am about to live, and my kids are about to live, is a world in which, to put it this way, as time passes by, we'll have to manage more issues with less means. And the longer we wait to do that, the worse the outcome. I think I'm done.
Thank you very much for this talk. Mindful of the time, maybe just one or two questions that you guys have posted on the Slido. The first one is, we're here, future business leaders at a business school. What options do we actually have and what should we do, if any? And the second one is a lot of questions related to renewables. What is your mind on this? And if we can do this within a few minutes, it would be great.
Well, on renewables, I will. My answer was already in my talk. Renewables require a lot of space, a lot of means. Energies may be renewables, but the device to collect them, not. You need, for example, 10 to 50 times more metal per kilowatt hour extracted from the environment when you use wind or solar than when you use fossil fuels or other concentrated powers. Okay. So you will hit another wall, if we want to keep the present world with only renewables, which is a wall of resources, particularly metal and space. So Sweden can go 100% renewable, okay? Sweden is 10 million people living on 350,000 square kilometers, 70% of which wood. They can have all the heat they want from wood, all the power they want from hydro and nuclear, which is not renewable, but can be almost if we move to breeders. They have iron ore on the spot, so they can have steel coming from hydrogen produced through electrolysis. So, okay, the industrial civilization can remain in Sweden, only they won't eat chocolate anymore because you didn't grow cocoa in Sweden. They will eat yogurt and whatever grows in Sweden, okay? But they can keep kind of an industrial civilization. But for the world as a whole, again, not a single second, fully on renewable. Second question, what should you do? Learn. Learn. If it's not in the courses of INSEAD, learn by yourself. Learn outside. You can read books. You can read scientific books. You can read vulgarizing books. You can listen to talks. You can learn. It's your best option.
Yeah, maybe we'll stop here. Thank you so much for maybe bringing a different vision than what we usually have here, painting the world maybe in a very grim way, but it seems that it's a probable future. There are a lot of questions that I will share with you afterwards, and we'll see how we can maybe deal with these. Please help me in thanking Mr. Jancovici here to come all the way to Fontainebleau to give this speech today.